Hello, good morning. Thank you for making it here for day 2, Black Hat Europe, despite ongoing rail action. All right, so before we get started with our keynote, Joe Sullivan, just a couple of thoughts. I was thinking back, I don't know if you see this blue book I've been carrying around. I make notes in here, and then I hardly ever refer to it during keynotes. But I opened this up, and some of my first notes are from February 2017. So I've been carrying this book around for a while, and after the show, I'm retiring it. I'm out of pages, so it's pretty perfect timing. And so I was looking back at, well, what are all the things we've talked about, and the things I've said, and things that have inspired my thought. And one of that goes back probably further than 2017 is this thought about, as an industry, what's forcing us to mature? Very little. I started off before, gosh, what was it, 98? With a company called Secure Computing Corporation. We were the first security company to ever be listed on the NASDAQ. So that tells you how old it is. And we made a security product, and it was the coolest, the best firewall, the Sidewinder. And everybody remembers the Sidewinder. Nobody remembers the name of the company. And our number one competitor was Check Point. So we had a company of engineers making the best product. They had a company of marketers selling an average product. Well, who won? Right? Check Point crushed us. And I think about that a lot. Why were we crushed? So at first, we were like, okay, we got to fix this, right? A bunch of us, we're going to start a labeling service. We're going to essentially reverse engineer products, and we're going to create like a consumer's report. And what will happen is consumers will be informed, and they'll buy the better product. And then the market will produce better products. This is the Volvo scenario. You build a better car, a safer car, and a bunch of people want to buy it. And that will force other competitors to increase. That never happened because you can't, there are no crash ratings, there's no crash tests. You can't just watch Volvos get in accidents and go, oh wow, statistically they survived. And so what did consumers do? They competed, they bought based on features. The more features you had, the more competitive you were, but technically you probably were less secure because you had more attack surface. Crap, that's not going to work. Okay, let's see. That's out. Informed consumers is out. Self-regulation is out. Insurance. Insurance companies, they've got the data. And what will happen is insurance companies will watch over the pool of companies, and they'll decide, hey, you're using this product, you're less likely to be compromised. Everybody, if you want a break on your insurance, use these products, not that. You have a home alarm system, you get a break. You have a car alarm system, you have a break, right? Does anybody remember that working? Yeah, no, that didn't work. That's okay. Cyber insurance will save us. So now, instead of just general insurance, we have specific cyber insurance. And this was hot for a number of years. And then ransomware actors started to figure out who had cyber insurance, and it target only them. They knew the payout levels. It didn't quite go the way that people were thinking. I don't hear a whole lot about cyber insurance anymore. What's left? What's on the tool belt? I'm running out of tools. Regulation. Right? We don't have that many tools left. We've got regulation in the tool belt. Okay, what's that going to do for us? Liability. We're going to get some software liability. How can the software industry, besides the, I guess you could say religion, why do they have no liability? Software shrink wrap license. Why can you disavow liability? That's crazy. You can't do that with cars or airplanes or other things. So that's where we're going to go. We're going to have software liability, and the thing that's going to get us there is going to be IoT devices. It's going to be a cheap coffee maker, internet connected, that burns down the house. And people are going to be angry, and they're going to sue, and we're going to get liability. Ransomware is going to happen. Why am I not protected? Why are my family photos gone? Hasn't happened, right? Maybe the software companies are too powerful lobbying against the regulation. Maybe it's sort of not the right time, right place for that kind of regulation. Something's going on. So we're kind of running out of tools in the tool belt. And then we have another form of regulation coming, right? This is more of the outcomes oriented. This is sort of the, how many breaches will we suffer until the government says enough? And I heard a lot of talk yesterday and last night around this concept of sort of like, are we entering our own Sarbanes-Oxley moment? And in the United States, after the collapse of Enron, Sarbanes-Oxley came around and said, you know, the CFO better sign off that the financials are sound and accurate. And if they're not, he's personally liable. CEO is personally liable, right? All of a sudden, Sarbanes-Oxley made it the problem of the CEO. Can't look the other way. And what I have a feeling is going to occur is these large attacks from foreign nation states, criminal organizations, impacting our infrastructure, our reliance on giant hyperscale and cloud services, right? As we concentrate risk, I believe they're going to face more regulation and more potential liability. And so that means what we're doing, whether we like it or not, our responsibilities are about, I believe, to take a turn, right? It's going to be upskilled, up or out. Things are going to be changing. Might not change this year, but if you look at what the potential bills and what's being talked about in the United States, it's going to change. And so that's why I'm super fascinated to see if this thing I've been talking about for almost over 10 years is finally going to start to occur, not because of IoT or ransomware or informed consumers or insurance, because either foreign nation states or the risks are just too great now, and governments finally said enough is enough. Lack of self-regulation, lack of market forces, right? The government finally says expectations are we regulate these areas. Maybe cryptocurrencies are what did it, right? Maybe the beginning of the collapse of some of these crypto coin exchanges finally attracted enough regulatory attention into like what's going on here. So that's why I'm fascinated, and I'm really proud to introduce Joe Sullivan as our keynote speaker. I first worked with Joe maybe over 10 years ago. He was on a task force I was co-chairing on cyber skills development for the Department of Homeland Security. Back then, he was the CSO at Facebook. And after that, he moved on to the CSO over at Uber. From Uber, he went to Cloudflare. So involvement at some pretty large-scale companies, you know, with global scale, global regulatory responsibilities. And Joe's talk today, he's going to be focusing on how the expectations of security are changing. So hopefully this will give you a glimpse into your possible future. So with that, it's my privilege to introduce Joe Sullivan.
Hey everyone, it's great to be here. I gave a talk similar to this talk at Black Hat in Las Vegas this summer, but I gave it to a group of just the security executives there. And it was after that conversation that I was talking to some of the folks like Jeff about how maybe this talk should be expanded out to a larger audience. And so here we are. Let me premise it all by saying I'm going to be talking a lot about a criminal case that was brought against me, a criminal case for which I was convicted, and so I have a felony conviction, but I'm appealing, so I have to be careful about what I specifically say about the facts of the case. So when I talk about the case, I'm not going to talk about my memory, I'm going to talk about what I saw sitting in the courtroom and what the judge saw, and try and present some of it from that perspective. But now let me jump in. I've been, like Jeff, I've been in security since the 1990s. I don't know, he might have been in the 80s, but I started out actually as a federal prosecutor in the United States. I was fortunate enough to be part of a small group in Silicon Valley who we full-time did high-tech crime starting in the 90s. And so what was it like to be a federal prosecutor in Las Vegas and then Northern California, Silicon Valley, trying to do tech crime prosecution in the 90s, I would spend my time going to the companies and saying, hey, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And they would say, we don't have any cyber crimes. They didn't want to talk about it if they did have it. There were no laws on the books requiring them to talk about it. And their PR people and their legal people said, there's no upside to talking about it, let's just cover it up, whatever. Eventually, we got some cases going, and I learned a lot through that experience. I moved into the private sector. I first went to eBay, where I worked on investigations. And my team, we would find abuse on eBay, and then we would bring it to law enforcement. So again, my job was talking and trying to bridge between the public and the private sector. I wanted to get, like, we would catch somebody committing thousands and thousands of dollars of fraud on eBay, and we wanted law enforcement to go after them. And we would typically go to the law enforcement agency and ask them, we would go to the law enforcement agency where the bad guy was. And so I traveled all over the world presenting to law enforcement and asking them, will you go after these bad guys who are harassing our customers? You know, I remember I took a trip to Romania to talk to the national police in, like, I think 2004. And the national police there were like, you want us to go arrest somebody local because an idiot in the United States thought that they could get a plasma TV for $200? And it was always hard to try and get them to understand the complexity and the challenges that the internet brought to law enforcement. Now, that kind of challenge still exists. Like, if we step back and think about the role of law enforcement in our society, why does law enforcement exist? To keep us safe, right? Law enforcement are the people that when we started as, like, when we came together as people in communities thousands of years ago, we wanted to have safety in our midst. Like, probably one of the #1 reasons that people came together in communities was self-preservation. And then we created these perimeters around ourselves, and we put people in charge of protecting us from the outside world. And that's worked really well for thousands of years until the internet came along, and it just blew up those perimeters. Because of the internet, people on the other side of the planet can do ransomware. Because of the internet, people on the other side of the planet can do harassing children. Because of the internet, people can make money all over the planet as well. And so the people building the internet said, we don't need the same rules and regulations. We don't need law enforcement inside at the level that we were before. And we all bought that argument because we saw the potential, the innovation, the opportunity. And that's a good place to be if you're the company that's going to make a lot of money on that IPO. But it's not a great place to be if you're the kid who's getting harassed on the platform, or the person who's getting defrauded, or the person who works in security who has to deal with their grandparents falling for the scams. And, my 80-year-old dad calls me all the time to ask about the texts that he gets. You probably all have to deal with that because people don't know who to turn to when a bad problem happens to them on the internet, and it happens to too many people. So I've gotten to witness this challenge, and I think probably what I've spent more time in my career doing than anything else is trying to get the public sector and the private sector to work together to keep people safe on the internet. Now, the irony is that's also the thing that got me in trouble, and I am the poster child potentially for not good cooperation between the public and private sector. So that also makes me most qualified to talk about some lessons learned from all of that. So I think we're in an amazing time, right? We are in a time of digital transformation. The world has changed so much. I just went online and found a list of the biggest companies in the world. 8 out of 10 I would classify as tech companies. 8 out of 10 didn't exist before the internet really became mainstream. And that's not going to change because there's so much power and opportunity inside these organizations. And there might be new organizations that come along, but it's going to be a challenge. So how does government think about regulating this world? You don't have to read the fine print, but this is a There's this guy, Matt Levine. He writes columns for Bloomberg in the United States, and he always talks about securities fraud. And I read his newsletters almost religiously, and I really like this one that came out last year. And he was talking about the cryptocurrency space, and he said there's two kinds of regulation that happen in the world. One is regulation by rulemaking, and one is regulation by enforcement. And he said the problem that's going on right now in the cryptocurrency space is that it's regulation by enforcement. So stepping back, what's the difference between regulation by enforcement and regulation by rulemaking? I'll give you an example of regulation by rulemaking that we all live with, GDPR. When I was the CSO at Facebook, I spent a lot of time in Europe talking to data protection authorities well before GDPR was a thing, because most of everything that was in GDPR was found in the laws of one or more of the countries of the EU. And so probably one of the biggest technical challenges I ever had to face was when, probably in 2010 or 2011, Facebook was told by one German, I think, regulator, you have to respect the right to be forgotten on Facebook. So if somebody deletes their account, you have to wipe every remnant of that account out of your servers. And that just wasn't the way our technology was architected. The way our back-end data storage, like you'd literally have to rewrite a whole table in order to remove a line. It's just the way it was architected. And also, as a young company, I wasn't sure where all the data was. But I was really happy that we got a very bright line rule that we had to follow, and the threat of significant financial penalties for the company. So I could turn inside the company and get every single team inside the company to document what data they had on users and where was it. Then the lawyers and people who did regulatory stuff had to go have debates with the regulators on, okay, if we have derivative data that makes up an algorithm that captures your facial recognition, is that the customer's data or is that our data because of some legal theory? But at least we knew exactly where we were supposed to be in the eyes of the regulators. So a year later, when we sat down and gave them direct access to our data and they made us do queries, they could hold us accountable if they could find an account that they had deleted 91 days ago before the time we said it'll be deleted within. That was a bright line thing. It was easy for me to get momentum and investment by the company in it. In general, in the United States, we don't have that kind of bright line set of rules around security. I don't think we really have it anywhere. And in fact, I would submit that we as security people we didn't want to break ourselves into jail. So most of the frameworks that we follow don't hold us accountable for actually being good at security. Like, does anybody think that going through ISO 27001 makes your company secure? It helps you write a bunch of policies, but doesn't actually say this is a secure environment. I don't want to pick a fight with the ISO people, but I would submit that the NIST cybersecurity framework, it measures your maturity. And so you can go through it and you can say, yeah, I'm on a journey to secure. Really, do we think that you, like Jeff was saying, are you allowed to put a car on the road when you're not quite sure that it's secure yet? But we're allowed to launch products and get millions of users before we invest a dime in security. So it's no wonder that, like Jeff said, self-regulation isn't working. It's no wonder that the insurance incentives aren't working. And so, we have different parts of government, right? Legislatures are supposed to pass the laws that set those bright line regulatory rules. The legislatures have not acted on cybersecurity to set those bright line rules. Probably the reason they haven't is because our companies have told them not to. And lobbied hard and spent a lot of money in those government centers. So there are still a bunch of other people in government who are held accountable for keeping people safe. Those are the regulators. They don't actually have the tools they need because they don't have the bright line rules. But they're going to use the tools that they have anyway. And that's how we end up in this world of regulation by enforcement. So about once a week, I get a call from somebody in the security community. They're either an existing CISO or CSO, or they're interviewing for their first one. And the question they always used to ask me was, what do I say to get the job? And I've coached a lot of people through that process. In the last few months, the question has changed. I've had this conversation so many times in the last couple of months. And the question that I get is, Joe, do I really want to do this? Why should I take on all of that personal risk? Look at all these examples. I mean, the SolarWinds one is just, it's just like, it's the only topic of conversation when you close the door with a room full of CISOs in the United States. And I won't go into the details of it. And, and obviously any piece of litigation, it's hard to tell from the outside what's really going on. And a lot of litigation, you never know what really happened in the end. So the SEC has charged Tim, the CISO from SolarWinds, and his company. And they put out this very long, what they call a complaint, which lists a lot of facts as colored by the government. And the interesting thing about Tim's case is that they say that he's responsible for what the company said about security, not just what they did or didn't do, but what they said. If you were to stop, so if there was a major data breach at a major company, local, and you stopped 10 random people on the street and asked them, okay, Target just had a massive data breach and your information is compromised. That company has a chief security officer. Who should be held accountable? What do you think the person on the street is going to say? The chief security officer. The chief security officer has a title. It says they're an officer. The SEC and the person on the street and the rest of the world all have a view of a chief security officer or a chief information security officer that's very different than the view that I have and all of you have and everybody in that role has. The reality of the role is that chief information security officer is fighting an uphill fight every day in their job. They're begging for resources. They're trying to get the rest of the company to slow down and think about the things that they care about. They have a team of people that they just, part of the job of a chief security officer is to be a cheerleader for your team. Keep fighting, don't worry. I know it doesn't feel like anybody's listening to you. We're making progress. We'll get more resources someday. That's what every chief information security officer feels like. I mean, it doesn't matter if you have the most resources in the world, you're always worried about something, and you always feel like there's something coming. Why is that? It's because our job is different from everybody else's. When you're the executive responsible for security, you are the only executive that has active adversaries outside your organization trying to destroy you. Right? And it's like the whole rest of the world doesn't get that fundamental point, that we're just here to play defense against really bad people who are trying to hurt our organization and our customers. And so we're in this difficult situation right now where we have a set of expectations that the world has of us and the reality of the role. And so that's why these people call me and say, what are we supposed to do? Am I supposed to jump into this set of expectations that I don't think they're paying me enough for and that I don't think I'm prepared for? And so tell me about all the things I need to know. So why do they call me about this? Because of the situation that I went through at Uber. I'm going to walk you through some of it. I don't want to spend too much time on it. I want to get more to the end where we talk about what do I actually say to the people in that situation. So I was the CSO at Uber. I started in late spring of 2015. I left Facebook and joined Uber. And in the fall of 2017, a little more than 2 years later, I got an email. I was up in the mountains in Northern California with my family. It was Thanksgiving week. I had taken the week off for vacation. And on the Tuesday of that week, the company had decided to fire me and set up a bunch of reporters to release a story that I had done a cover-up. So I got 2 emails while I was in a grocery store with my daughters. One email was from the company, and it said, you can sign the attached document in the next 45 minutes, and if you sign it, we'll say that you resigned, and if you don't sign it, we'll say that you're fired. Shortly after, I got this email from Eric Newcomer, who's a reporter for Bloomberg, and he said, I'd appreciate comment on your ouster. First off, I had to look up ouster. But second, how did he know that I was fired when I hadn't actually been fired yet? I was still trying to figure out how to open the attachment and see if I wanted to sign this document. Well, while I was still figuring that out, the company bricked my laptop and phone, thanks my old team, and I had to grab my ex-wife's computer and go online and figure out what was going on. And I learned that I was front page news globally for covering up a major data breach. And of course, Twitter went wild, everything went crazy from there. And then jump forward 2.5 years later, August of 2020, I was working at Cloudflare, and my daughter calls me, and she says, Dad, what happened? I'm like, what are you talking about, what happened? And she said, a friend of mine heard on National Public Radio that you've been arrested. Are you in jail right now? And I'm like, no, I'm at home. What are you talking about? I haven't been arrested. And she said, well, it's on the national news that you've been arrested. Well, I wasn't arrested. That press release that the FBI put out was false, and they did correct it eventually. But I was charged with a crime. I was charged with 2. I was charged with obstruction of justice, specifically related to a Federal Trade Commission in the United States investigation of Uber. They charged me with obstructing that investigation. And I was charged with something called misprision of a felony, which is a gift to the United States from the British, common law statutory thing that basically says if you help somebody cover up that they committed a felony, then it's a felony for you as well. So I went to trial in September of 2022. This is a drawing of the courtroom. Cameras aren't allowed in courts in the United States. Other than my sentencing hearing, which was on Zoom video, and I didn't even know that at the time, but a lot of people got to see it. So this is a drawing one of my daughters did while she was sitting in the courtroom. That's me on the left wearing a mask. I didn't testify, so the whole trial I was just a man in a suit with a black mask on representing Uber, which is probably not a good look to any jury. And then this was the judge, and that just happened that in the drawing that my daughter did, that's Candace. She was the head lawyer for the privacy organization at the company, and it was her team that oversaw all of the interaction with the government regulators. And she was testifying that she knew about and had been looped in on the investigation because my team and I had made sure that legal was in the loop. So let me jump back to how do we get to that point where I was in trial? When I started, let's see, going way back, in 2008 when I worked at PayPal, we published a responsible disclosure policy. I think it might have been the first corporate responsible disclosure policy. And what it said was, we won't prosecute you or refer you to law enforcement if you bring a security issue to us, because our priority as a company is we want to find these things. I personally remember when I left being a prosecutor and I went to eBay and then PayPal, I remember the first time one of the security engineers came to me and was like, Joe, here's an email we got from someone saying that they found a vulnerability and they don't want to give it to us unless we pay them money. This was 20 years ago, and I was like, that's extortion. I was like angry. You know, I was coming from that prosecutor perspective, and I was like, they could help us help our customers, and they won't. I was really angry. But after 6 years working inside a company, you're desperate. You want all of the information you can get. And you also realize, whoa, if I only have to pay when I get results, that's way better than all those pen testing companies I've been using. And so I became a total convert. My team and I did. That's why we worked on and put out this responsible disclosure policy at Uber, because we did it 8 years earlier at PayPal. I went to Facebook, and I think by 2009, at least 2010, we put out a Facebook responsible disclosure policy. Then we launched, I think, the third ever bug bounty program that was public at Facebook on my team. In fact, a couple of members of my team went on to become co-founders of HackerOne because of the experience they had running our bug bounty program at Facebook. Like, we bought that religion and we believe in it. And I have had so many people on my teams that we hired because we met them through these bounty programs. Those are good people that we want to work with. So right after I got to Uber, we launched this. And then as soon as we could, we launched a bug bounty program. It actually took us a year to launch a bug bounty program at Uber because we were afraid that we would get just inundated because we knew that we had really bad security. So we put it out really slowly and kept it as a private program and then worked it up to public over time. So then in the fall of 2016, November 14th, this email came into me. Hey, I found a major vulnerability in Uber. I was able to dump Uber database and many other things. I was used to getting an email like this about once a week at that point. And I did what I always do. I forwarded it over to our bug bounty team that sits under product security, or sat under product security. And then Rob Fletcher, who was a member of that team, and in fact, we had hired Rob into Uber because we met him when he made a responsible disclosure to us. So he was the perfect guy to be doing this interaction back and forth because he had literally been on the other side before he joined Uber. And so Rob reached out to the person and said, hi, my name's Rob. I work on ProdSec at Uber. I understand you have a vuln. Our preferred method of interaction is our public bounty program at HackerOne. But if you like to use email, we're happy with that. So that was the initial interaction. They had a bunch of back and forth. A lot of my team testified at the trial about that back and forth. And the government wanted to portray it that the people on the other side were evil villains who were after us. And my team explained that they didn't view it that way. This was actually a slide from the trial that I think my lawyers used in the closing. And they kind of walked through what our CISO said. Well, the language that they used wasn't unusual. The fact that they downloaded data to prove that they had access happens frequently. The amount that they asked for, common, in line with the seriousness of it. Even Dara, the new CEO of Uber, who fired me, he testified that paying the money was absolutely the right thing to do. So that all came from the trial. The other thing, when people, I try not to watch these things when people are talking about me, but I've seen that there have been a lot of different webinars and all these lawyers put on these programs where they say, come join my session and I'll tell you how you avoid turning out like Joe. And they always say the same things. Have D&O insurance. Have a really good documentation of how you're handling your incident. Have an incident response plan that delegates all decision-making to legal, and so on and so on. And guess what? We had all those things at Uber then. We weren't a clown show. When I showed up in 2015, the security team was 5 people. But by the time the fall of 2016 had come around, we had over 100. By 2017, when I got fired, I think we had 500. We were growing like crazy, and we were trying to fix it and make it better. And so this is an exhibit. It was called the Central Tracker. A team member kept notes of every single meeting that we had, and even wrote down what the legal advice we were getting day by day was. We called it the Preacher Central Tracker. My team labeled, one of the fun things in security is you get to name your investigations. And my team called this case Preacher. We called it Preacher because of the tone that the guy on the other side took with us. He was lecturing my team, and they thought that was kind of funny. Like, this guy just keeps preaching that we're not doing a good enough job. And we're like, we know, we're working on it, dude. We knew pretty quickly we weren't dealing with a nation state. The team told me, we're dealing with some teenagers. And we want to handle them with kid gloves. We want to get them to the right place. It wasn't a little thing where we got 3 people in a room. The first meeting, legal was involved, and the communications expert was involved. I was fortunate enough when I was at Uber to work with Melanie Ensign, who's an outstanding security communications person. She was in the room throughout the process. She was fully briefed, and she did the right thing. She actually escalated to her manager and all the way up to her exec, who ran public policy and communications for the company. So that whole line in the company knew about it. The team followed the incident response policy and brought in Craig Clark, the lawyer who was listed in the formal documents as the lawyer we're supposed to loop in for these things. And as I mentioned earlier, Candace, who ran the privacy team, testified that she was in the loop as well. Like I said, we had a breach incident. We have a playbook that said legal is responsible for deciding whether reporting is required at any contact with law enforcement and advising on all legal issues. So the team always followed that. It wasn't like this was our first rodeo. It was a situation where we were probably going to legal asking for advice on whether something was a breach once a week. Like, it was a pretty intense place during that time because we were digging out. Legal said in this case, okay, if 3 things happen, it's not something that's going to be disclosable. And then it's up to the company whether they want to talk about it. Number 1, security team, make sure that they don't have the data and it's not out in the wild. And the number 2, let's get them in a contract. The contract, that NDA, the government just kept saying over and over again, the NDA is the cover-up. You bribe these guys to not say anything about your bad security. Well, we finally got to my sentencing hearing in this May of this year, and the court just said, before the judge sentenced me, he said, I'm just going to go after the NDA. The NDA argument the government makes doesn't fly. It wasn't a cover-up. It was part of the ability to solve the problem, in my view. That's what the judge in my case said. Why did he say that? Because he saw the evidence that came in. I want to do a presentation someday with my team on the actual investigation that they did, because it was amazing. I had such a good team. There were 5 companies, I think, that got notified by these teenagers. Well, actually, one was 19 and one was 20. These young men notified 5 companies that they'd found similar vulnerabilities. I think 3 of them did nothing. 1 contacted the FBI. The FBI opened an investigation and tried to find them and failed. And my team, we went and found them. And it was because we did the usual thing you do when you're trying to find someone. You engage with them, you go back and forth with them, and sooner or later, they make a mistake. And then we were able to link a few accounts in crypto wallets and so on down the line, which was pretty advanced for 2016, and we found the people responsible, and we determined that the main person was a young man named Brandon, living in a trailer park in Florida, dealing with a lot of issues, staying at home most of the time. So what did we do? We reached out to Brandon. This is the email that Matt on my team says is the most enjoyable email he's ever sent in his life. It says, "Hey, Brandon." Now remember, Brandon didn't know that we knew his name at this point, and all of a sudden this email pops up in his regular inbox. It says, "Hey, Brandon, wanted to reach out now that the holiday's over. I appreciate the help from you guys. Great catch, an example of the value the program brings us in the community. There are a few things we need to follow up on. First, you need to sign that contract with your real name. And I need you guys to sign some other stuff from the financial standpoint. And you're likely running into issues with some of those other companies as you try and work with their programs too. What you risk by not being open with identity is the companies can perceive it as extortion rather than research, and you don't want that. I've been involved with bounty programs, all my previous companies. I'm happy to talk things through with you and help you navigate the nuances. Also, I want to invite you to visit us in the Bay Area at our headquarters. We wanted them to come and do a presentation for our team on how they had done everything. I can introduce you to our ProdSec team, and we want to hear more about your research methodologies, OPSEC strategy, et cetera. And then the kicker at the end, I happen to have one of my team members down in Florida right now. Also, he didn't know that we knew where he was. So I have a team member down in Florida, and he will meet with you tomorrow to get the contract signed. Let me know what time works best for you so we can decide on a location such as a hotel or restaurant in nearby Winter Springs. So that was the reveal email, but it was also like trying to teach a lesson. And then the next day when Brandon went, actually Brandon didn't want to leave his house, and so our team member went. So one of my team members, he had recently joined the team from the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, where he was their lead interrogator. So he's an expert on interrogation, and we positioned him to meet with Brandon. He prepared for us a 5-page detailed memorandum doing a psychological profile analysis of Brandon and a lot about his background, his fears, his challenges as a person, and most importantly, whether we believed that he'd actually deleted the data and he wasn't going to hurt anybody. And so we reached the conclusion that Brandon needed help. My team actually tried to get him a job at some security companies because we think he's a talented person. He probably can't get that now because he has a felony conviction also. So let me go back to what I was charged with, now that you know a little bit about the background of the case. Obstruction of proceedings before the Federal Trade Commission was the main count that I think gets in the news and that people think about and talk about in my case. In this situation, when I started at Uber at the beginning of 2015, it was a nightmare situation from a security standpoint. I ran toward it. I was excited to go there and work on security because it was so bad. And I knew I was going to get a big budget and I was going to get to build the team I wanted from scratch. In 2014, the company had had a major data breach. The company had suffered, people had suffered through a really tragic sexual assault situation that happened in India between an Uber driver and rider that was global news and kind of drew attention to the risks of this type of transportation. And there were a bunch of stories about how people inside Uber were looking up customer data and using it in ways they shouldn't be. And so I came into that. I actually redid the investigation right when I started of that 2014 data breach, and I figured out who was responsible. The team that had been there before I got there just didn't have the capability to do it, and they didn't have the experience. And so I redid the investigation. I mostly redid the investigation because I wanted to learn from it about some of our vulnerabilities. And I contacted the FBI, and I referred it to the FBI. We gave them the case on a platter. In 2016, they declined to go forward, even though it was, I thought, a very good case. But the FTC did open an investigation of Uber related to that. So the people responsible didn't get prosecuted, but Uber got investigated. And so the FTC had a whole bunch of different investigations of Uber going on for different reasons. I'm not privy to all of them. But one of them was looking into the data security practices in place as of 2014 when those incidents happened. And so I had to explain to the FTC, what is the status of our security program right now? Where are we going? I gave a deposition in which I said we have a long way to go, a couple of months before, I think, the incident in this case. So the company was having a lot of back and forth with the FTC about our security posture at that time. And the government felt that the company was not forthcoming enough because the company didn't tell the government about this specific investigation. Now, they hadn't asked the company to turn over any data on anything related to bug bounty, which I find perplexing, because I would think that if I was the government, that would be the first thing I would ask for, because that shows actual concrete vulnerabilities. And in fact, when the trial took place, it came into evidence that I personally hadn't seen most of the documents that the government felt were, actually these are all the documents that the government received, and the ones on the bottom were the ones that I may or may not have seen, and the ones on the top are the ones that there was no evidence that I saw. And so it was actually some of the earlier documents. The government felt like, oh, the way you described your security in those early documents, given that you were having ongoing issues, you should have gone back and clarified some things with us. And so they held us accountable for not being fully transparent with them. Now, the interesting thing about that second count, and so I should say the basis for my appeal on count one related to representations to the FTC was, my view was it's not my job, it was legal's job to do that communication. And in some areas of the law, you're not responsible if you're not a person in the role that has the duty to do the disclosure. And so my argument on appeal is that the chief security officer doesn't have the duty to be transparent. It's the teams that actually do the communication that have the duty to be transparent. So that's the ground for appeal on that matter. The second count is misprision of a felony. So what the government said was the underlying felony was when those two young men accessed our environment. So when they went into our environment without authorization, they violated 18 U.S.C. 1030, which is the U.S. Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And that basically says when you access a computer without permission, that's a crime. And then it goes up from there depending on what you did. And the government said when those guys accessed our cloud, they didn't have permission. So the jury thought about that, and they sent out two questions to the judge. And they said, wait a minute, can't the company give authorization after the fact? And then, in fact, that's the law in general, what they call common law, that if somebody comes into my front yard, even when, I have a sign that says no trespassing, someone comes in my front yard, the police don't have a right to arrest that person no matter what. I can actually say, oh no, that's my cousin, it's okay for them to come in. And HackerOne and BugCrowd and all these companies, that's the view they've taken forever with regard to security researchers. Because if you think about it, the first time a researcher finds a vulnerability in any company, what do they already have a contractual relationship with the company where the company gave them permission? Most of the time, especially back in 2016, the answer was no. Researchers would go poke around at a bunch of sites, and if they found something, then they'd go join the program. And by government definition, every one of those people has committed a felony. And if we as the company entered into agreement with them afterwards, the company will have committed a felony. That's the government view on my case. And so that's why we're appealing the second count. So the good news is, for me at least, when we got to the sentencing hearing, the judge said, the nature of this case is unprecedented, and because of your good character, I'm not going to give you a custodial sentence. Like one of my daughters in the courtroom just gasped, like the whole, it was like out of a movie, at least from where I was sitting, the intensity of like emotion to know that I wasn't going to go to prison. But then the judge did something which I thought was interesting. He gave a gift to everybody in the security world. He said, if I have a similar case tomorrow, even if the defendant has the character of Pope Francis, they're going to prison. Now, why did the judge do that? because he didn't, I think he was actually thinking about this whole concept of rulemaking by enforcement versus rulemaking by regulation. He was giving us a clear message. You know, like I talked about GDPR before. GDPR says if you violate this, up to 4% of your revenue or whatever the number is, right? Like, it's a huge penalty. It's a clear penalty and a clear line. And the judge wanted to say, in the future, no free passes. I expect that companies are going to understand that they have to be transparent with the government. And if not, they're going to jail. And he also said something else. And this is in small text. I remain perplexed that the CEO was not present at all in this case. Where was he? I am left with the impression he was at least as culpable as Mr. Sullivan, and nobody brought him to court. And then he proceeded to grill the prosecutor. Why isn't the company also a defendant? Why isn't the CEO also a defendant? Why are you picking on the security person? Because this judge had heard from hundreds of people that it's not fair to hold a security leader responsible by themselves. The judge was mad at my lawyers because we submitted hundreds of letters asking the judge to be lenient on me. And he was a little bit more understanding than the average person on the street about the reality of our profession. So to go back to that average person on the street, that's the juror. They're going to say, if you are the chief security officer and your company sucks at security, it's your fault. And I think that all takes us back to Jeff's point at the beginning. The world is sick of bad security, and we have to hear the wake-up call. We are in this situation right now where there's a lack of clarity on expectations. A lot of the CISO groups that I'm in right now, they're looking at the SolarWinds case and my case, and they're saying, what are we going to do? We need to have a better, the bad news is those people, they're not thinking about the big picture. They're thinking about themselves. Because why wouldn't you if you're a security leader? Or if you're someone who's about to step up? Or if you're someone in your role where you're thinking, maybe, do I want to try and go to that? Or do I want to get the hell out of this profession? I actually think we need to take a different point of view. I don't think we should run away from the situation. I don't think that we should spend all of our time and energy on CYA. Because if we do, we're going to miss a huge opportunity. This actually came to me on one of those phone calls that I was having a few weeks ago, where I was talking to a guy who was a deputy CISO of a public company, and he's like, Joe, I don't know if I want to do this job. And I said, get the offer, and then have a real conversation with the general counsel and the CEO. If they're on board and they understand this new world, you have a golden opportunity. The world is going to change. The world of security that we know it right now is going to change. Like in that CISO summit that I was at a couple of days ago here, there was a lot of people talking about, we just got to get the basics done. Well, 5 years from now, that's not going to fly. We can't be a world that's just focusing on the basics, or else there's going to be 20 more people in jail, and 20 more people facing charges. And we should look at other areas. You know, if you think about what's happening in cryptocurrency right now and what's happening in AI right now, they've gone from idea to engagement with government on what the regulation should be really quickly. Now, arguably, those areas are a total mess as well, but at least we have technical people in the room with government people trying to debate what the rules should be. I would submit that in the context of cybersecurity, there's nobody representing all of you in the room debating what the rules should be. And I'd also submit that a lot of our CISOs are handcuffed by two things. Number one, they're handcuffed by their own, fear of the reality of their own situation. So they're more worried about how do I survive and get my team to the right place and me avoid getting in trouble when there's a crisis. and all of us who are just like trying to get the job done. I do some advising and consulting with companies, and I see that every company I go into has a long way to go. And I don't think that's going to fly in the future. So I have spent a lot of time talking to people about like, how do we move forward? I think for executives, I would spend a half hour on the next few slides here, but I'm just going to go through with you really quickly. If you have to go through something like I went through, you have to have a serious plan. I called it the personal incident response plan, and one of the guys at the session 2 days ago said, "Did you mean to call it the PERP plan?" But that was pretty good. But we do need to have a personal response plan, because it's tough emotionally to spend 6 years seeing your name in the news saying that you did something wrong, and that if you had just done the right thing, everything would have turned out differently. It's a very financially burdensome situation to go through. You know, I had to hire 5 different law firms over the course of the last 6, 7 years, 3 different PR firms. I had to figure out and navigate a lot of things. Why a PR firm? Everybody always asks me. Well, here's there was a news article with the recent SEC stuff. Everybody's writing about my case again. And so this was V1 that was in the news that someone saw and sent to me. It said, whereas Mr. Sullivan was found guilty of lying to company leadership, misleading regulators, and forging documents. Like, that was literally in a published article. And I was like, what? And so I had to have a PR person reach out, and they changed it to, the version, if you find the article now, it just says, whereas Joe Sullivan was found guilty of obstruction and misprison. But like, every time an article comes out, somebody thinks they know what happened in my case, and they just write it. So I do think that people need that D&O insurance or something equivalent to that if they're in the exec role, and I spent a lot of time talking to CISOs about that and about having some money set aside. All my bank accounts got shut down. My homeowners and car insurance got canceled. Like, lots of things happen to you when you get charged with a crime that you don't expect. You'd be surprised how many people, when they get thrown into these situations, aren't ready to be what I call a public figure. Like, you better make sure that you didn't say anything stupid on previously known as Twitter 7 years ago, because someone's going to find it. If you said anything in a chat at a prior company and they want to throw you under the bus for not caring about security there too, they'll find that. And then it's not just you. Like I told you in my case, I had to deal with the situation where my daughters were finding out about things before me. And having family support through that is a good thing. I mean, I think that like your support networks are the most important thing. So I also spend a lot of time talking to CISOs about how do you get ready for a crisis? I don't think it's one person who solves a crisis, it's a team that solves a crisis. And so we all need to have security teams that can handle not just documenting the risk, not just editing the code, not just, giving cupcakes to the people who repair the vulnerabilities. We need to have people on our team who are good at crisis response. I have seen too many incidents where we had the wrong person in the room and I had to remove them because they just panicked. We need to have people who are calm under pressure, who understand process even on a crisis. We also have to have a different and better relationship with our communications teams. A lot of CISOs make the mistake of saying, oh, I have a great relationship with the PR person who's assigned to my team. Well, guess what? In a crisis, that's not the PR person who's going to be in the room. It's going to be the head of PR. It's going to be the general counsel. It's not going to be the lawyer who is assigned to your team. And there are going to be a bunch of business leaders there also. Like, that's one of the top things that CISOs are concerned about right now is there are these new reporting obligations, and they're very opaque, materiality. And so what happens when the CISO is in the middle of an incident, and you're like, I just want to focus on the incident. I think this might be important. We should probably do a disclosure. And then you're going back to the incident. And then what happens? The business leader who's trying to close a bunch of contracts before the end of that quarter is going to say, I don't think it's material. Let's keep this quarter rolling. I'm going to close some big deals. Like, the CISO has to be in that room, in that conversation, instead of running the incident. So they better trust their team. And so, like, the best piece of advice I ever got on this was way back when I was at eBay. I felt like responding to incidents all day long. My team was running around putting out fires, and it felt like we were just exhausted. And so our COO had a fireside chat, and I raised my hand and I said, I feel like my team just puts out fires and it's burning us out. And he said, if it's your job to put out fires, build a fire department. I was like, what? He's like, you could go by a fire department while a team is putting out a major fire. And what will you see at the fire station? You'll see another team asleep. You'll see another team polishing the engines and getting ready, because they're built to put out fires. They have ladders long enough to reach the tallest building in their city. They've planned ahead, and they have reinforcements. And so I think we have to do a better job building our own fire departments on our teams. And we have to get better at communicating internally. We got to make more friends. When I had an exec coach when I was at Facebook, and she said, Joe, you're like that Peanuts character, the one who has the cloud over him wherever he goes. When the other executives see you coming, that's what they see, because you only show up for two things: to tell them, no, you can't do that project that you're so excited about making so much money for, or we're hacked. So those are the only two things you ever tell anybody. So whenever they see you, they see a cloud and they run away. How are you going to build relationships with these people? Go spend more time with them. Build trust before the crisis. So I am just about out of time, but I want to talk about one last point. I really believe that our profession is about to go in one of two directions. We're going to become the team that's down in the weeds, dealing with the technical controls, and not invited to the exec room, or we're going to become a team that is highly respected and trusted at the highest levels of government and our corporations. Because make note, look, Jeff said we're going to get into a world where there's going to be a Sarbanes-Oxley for security. We are. We're going to have independent auditors coming in on an annual basis, looking at and reviewing the work we did during that year. And they're not going to put us on that NIST framework and say, okay, you're at level 2, that's cool, you can maybe get to level 4 in 18 months. No. You have to be at maturity or you're going to fail that audit, and your public company shouldn't be able to sell your products. Because I think at the end of the day, that's the world we live in. We need to build products that keep people safe. Governments have had enough, people have had enough, and so I think the challenge for all of you is, what profession do you want to be in? Like we all talk about, like, I like the technical parts. Well, we have to figure out how to keep our hand in the technical stuff, but we also have to learn how to become real executives. The person who leads you needs to know how to run a business unit. They need to know how to read a P&L statement. They need to know how to argue with the board, not just stand in front of the board and present some slides that you put together for them. The world's changing right now, and we got to get with it, or we're going to be left behind. So like the Lorax said, who speaks for you and your view of the profession? Are you in the room? Are you supporting nonprofits or organizations that take your view to the regulators before the crisis that hits your team? That's the question. I'll just leave you with this. I just got here. I flew in from Poland, but I spent last week in Ukraine. I go to Ukraine a lot. If you work at a company that has laptops, you probably leave them in a pile when you're done with them. I would love to take those laptops to Ukraine and give them to kids who have lost. We give out laptops to kids who've lost a parent in the war and who can't afford a laptop, and in most cases are in remote schooling. Half the kids in Ukraine are still in remote schooling because of the war, because they're afraid to go to school, or they can't go to school because it blew up. I would love to bring laptops from your company to Ukraine to give them to these kids. They're amazing. They're learning to code in the middle of a war. They want a future for themselves and their family. And message me if your company's willing to do it. I've brought hundreds and hundreds of laptops over there, and they all came. Every single laptop I've brought to Ukraine came because of somebody in the security community who got their company to donate their used laptops. So thank you for your time today, and have a good rest of the conference.